What is authority? In order to avoid misunderstanding, it might have been wiser to ask in the title, what was and not what is authority? For it is my contention that we are tempted and entitled to raise this question because authority has vanished from the modern world. Since we can no longer fall back upon authentic and undisputable experiences common to all, the very term has become clouded by controversy and confusion. Little about its nature appears self-evident or even comprehensible to everybody, except that the political scientist may still remember that this concept was once fundamental to political theory, or that most will agree that a constant, ever-widening and deepening crisis of authority has accompanied the development of the modern world in our century. This crisis, apparent since the inception of the century, is political in origin and nature. The rise of political movements intent upon replacing the party system and the development of a new totalitarian form of government took place against a background of a more or less general, more or less dramatic breakdown of all traditional authorities. Nowhere was this breakdown the direct result of the regimes or movements themselves. It rather seemed as though totalitarianism, in the form of movements as well as of regimes, was best fitted to take advantage of a general political and social atmosphere in which the party system had lost its prestige and the government's authority was no longer recognized. The most significant symptom of the crisis, indicating its depth and seriousness, is that it has spread to such pre-political areas as child-rearing and education, where authority in the widest sense has always been accepted as a natural necessity, obviously required as much by natural needs, the helplessness of the child, as by political necessity, the continuity of an established civilization which can be assured only if those who are newcomers by birth are guided through a pre-established world into which they are born as strangers. Because of its simple and elementary character, this form of authority has, throughout the history of political thought, served as a model for a great variety of authoritarian forms of government, so that the fact that even this pre-political authority, which ruled the relations between adults and children, teachers and pupils, is no longer secure, signifies that all the old time-honored metaphors and models for authoritarian relations have lost their plausibility. Practically as well as theoretically, we are no longer in a position to know what authority really is. In the following reflections, I assume that the answer to this question cannot possibly lie in a definition of the nature or essence of authority in general. The authority we have lost in the modern world is no such authority in general, but rather a very specific form which had been valid throughout the Western world over a long period of time. I therefore propose to reconsider what authority was historically and the sources of its strength and meaning. Yet, in view of the present confusion, it seems that even this limited and tentative approach must be preceded by a few remarks on what authority never was, in order to avoid the more common misunderstandings and make sure that we visualize and consider the same phenomenon and not any number of connected or unconnected issues. Since authority always demands obedience, it is commonly mistaken for some form of power or violence. Yet, authority precludes the use of external means of coercion. Where force is used, authority itself has failed. Authority, on the other hand, is incompatible with persuasion, which presupposes equality and works through a process of argumentation. Where arguments are used, authority is left in abeyance. Against the egalitarian order of persuasion stands the authoritarian order, which is always hierarchical. If authority is to be defined at all, then it must be in contradistinction to both coercion by force and persuasion through arguments. The authoritarian relation between the one who commands and the one who obeys rests neither on common reason nor on the power of the one who commands. What they have in common is the hierarchy itself. whose rightness and legitimacy both recognize and where both have their predetermined stable place. This point is of historical importance. One aspect of our concept of authority is Platonic in origin, and when Plato began to consider the introduction of authority into the handling of public affairs in the polis, he knew he was seeking an alternative to the common Greek way of handling domestic affairs, which was persuasion, as well as to the common way of handling foreign affairs, which was force and violence. Historically, we may say that the loss of authority is merely the final, though decisive phase of a development which for centuries undermined primarily religion and tradition. Of tradition, religion, and authority, whose interconnectedness we shall discuss later, authority has proved to be the most stable element. With the loss of authority, however, the general doubt of the modern age also invaded the political realm, where things not only assume a more radical expression, but become endowed with a reality peculiar to the political realm alone. What perhaps hitherto had been of spiritual significance only for the few now has become a concern of one and all. Only now, as it were after the fact, the loss of tradition and of religion have become political events of the first order. The concentration and extermination camps of totalitarian regimes serve as the laboratories in which the fundamental belief of totalitarianism that everything is possible is being verified. Compared with this, all other experiments are secondary in importance, including those in the field of medicine whose horrors are recorded in detail in the trials against the physicians of the Third Reich. Although it is characteristic that these laboratories were used for experiments of every kind. Total domination, which strives to organize the infinite plurality and differentiation of human beings as if all of humanity were just one individual, is possible only if each and every person can be reduced to a never-changing identity of reactions, so that each of these bundles of reactions can be exchanged at random for any other. The problem is to fabricate something that does not exist, namely a kind of human species resembling other animal species, whose only freedom would consist in preserving the species. Totalitarian domination attempts to achieve this goal both through ideological indoctrination of the elite formations and through absolute terror in the camps. And the atrocities for which the elite formations are ruthlessly used become, as it were, the practical application of the ideological indoctrination, the testing ground in which the latter must prove itself, while the appalling spectacle of the camps themselves is supposed to furnish the theoretical verification of the ideology. The camps are meant not only to exterminate people and degrade human beings, but also serve the ghastly experiment of eliminating, under scientifically controlled conditions, spontaneity itself as an expression of human behavior and of transforming the human personality into a mere thing, into something that even animals are not. For Pavlov's dog, which, as we know, was trained to eat not when it was hungry, but when a bell rang, was a perverted animal. There is a great temptation to explain away the intrinsically incredible by means of liberal rationalizations. In each one of us, there lurks such a liberal, wheedling us with the voice of common sense. The road to totalitarian domination leads through many intermediate stages for which we can find numerous analogies and precedents. The extraordinarily bloody terror during the initial stage of totalitarian rule serves indeed the exclusive purpose of defeating the opponent and rendering all further opposition impossible. But total terror is launched only after this initial stage has been overcome and the regime no longer has anything to fear from the opposition. In this context, it has been frequently remarked that in such a case the means have become the end. But this is, after all, only an admission, in paradoxical disguise, that the category, the end justifies the means, no longer applies, that terror has lost its purpose, that it is no longer the means to frighten people. Nor does the explanation suffice that the revolution, as in the case of the French Revolution, was devouring its own children. For the terror continues even after everybody who might be described as a child of the revolution, in one capacity or another, the Russian factions, the power centers of party, the army, the bureaucracy, has long since been devoured. Many things that nowadays have become the specialty of totalitarian government are only too well known from the study of history. There have almost always been wars of aggression. The massacre of hostile populations after a victory went unchecked until the Romans mitigated it by introducing the parcere subjectis. Through centuries, the extermination of native peoples went hand in hand with the colonization of the Americas, Australia, and Africa. Slavery is one of the oldest institutions of mankind, and all empires of antiquity were based on the labor of state-owned slaves who erected their public buildings. Not even concentration camps are an invention of totalitarian movements. On The Crisis in Culture. For more than 10 years now, we have witnessed a still growing concern among intellectuals with the relatively new phenomenon of mass culture. The term itself clearly derives from the not much older term mass society. The tacit assumption underlying all discussions of the matter is that mass culture, logically and inevitably, is the culture of mass society. The most significant fact about the short history of both terms is that, while even a few years ago, they were still used with a strong sense of reprobation, implying that mass society was a depraved form of society and mass culture, a contradiction in terms they now have become respectable, the subject of innumerable studies and research projects whose chief effect, as Harold Rosenberg pointed out, is to add to kitsch an intellectual dimension. This intellectualization of kitsch is justified on the grounds that mass society, whether we like it or not, is going to stay with us into the foreseeable future. Hence, its culture, popular culture, cannot be left to the populace. However, the question is whether what is true for mass society is true for mass culture also, or, to put it another way, whether the relationship between mass society and culture will be mutatis mutandis, the same as the relation of society toward culture which preceded it. The question of mass culture raises first of all another and more fundamental problem, namely the highly problematic relationship of society and culture. One needs only to recall to what an extent the entire movement of modern art started with a vehement rebellion of the artist against society as such, and not against a still unknown mass society, in order to become aware how much this earlier relationship must have left to be desired, and thus to beware of the facile yearning of so many critics of mass culture for a golden age of good and genteel society. This yearning is much more widespread today in America than it is in Europe for the simple reason that America, though only too well acquainted with the barbarian Philistinism of the nouveau riche, has only a nodding acquaintance with the equally annoying cultural and educated Philistinism of European society, where culture has acquired snob value, where it has become a matter of status to be educated enough to appreciate culture. This lack of experience may even explain why American literature and painting has suddenly come to play such a decisive role in the development of modern art, and why it can make its influence felt in countries whose intellectual and artistic vanguard has influence felt in countries whose intellectual and artistic vanguard has adopted outspoken anti-American attitudes. It has, however, the unfortunate consequence that the profound malaise which the very word culture is likely to evoke precisely among those who are its foremost representatives may go unnoticed or not be understood in its symptomatic significance. The 3 decades from 1884 to 1914 separate the 19th century, which ended with the scramble for Africa and the birth of the Pan movements, from the 20th, which began with the First World War. This is the period of imperialism, with its stagnant quiet in Europe and breathtaking developments in Asia and Africa. some of the fundamental aspects of this time appear so close to totalitarian phenomena of the 20th century that it may be justifiable to consider the whole period a preparatory stage for coming catastrophes. Its quiet, on the other hand, makes it appear still very much a part of the 19th century. We can hardly avoid looking at this close and yet distant past with the too wise eyes of those who know the end of the story in advance, who know it led to an almost complete break in the continuous flow of Western history as we had known it for more than 2,000 years. But we must also admit a certain nostalgia for what can still be called a golden age of security, for an age, that is, when even horrors were still marked by a certain moderation and controlled by respectability, and therefore could be related to the general appearance of sanity. In other words, no matter how close to us this past is, we are perfectly aware that our experience of concentration camps and death factories is as remote from its general atmosphere as it is from any other period in Western history. The central inner European event of the imperialist period was the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie, which up to then had been the first class in history to achieve economic preeminence without aspiring to political rule. The bourgeoisie had developed within and together with the nation-state, which almost by definition ruled over and beyond a class-divided society. Even when the bourgeoisie had already established itself as the ruling class, it had left all political decisions to the state. Only when the nation-state proved unfit to be the framework for the further growth of capitalist economy did the latent fight between state and society become openly a struggle for power. During the imperialist period, neither the state nor the bourgeoisie won a decisive victory. National institutions resisted throughout the brutality and megalomania of imperialist aspirations, and bourgeois attempts to use the state and its instruments of violence for its own economic purposes were always only half successful. This changed when the German bourgeoisie staked everything on the Hitler movement and aspired to rule with the help of the mob. But then it turned out to be too late. The bourgeoisie succeeded in destroying the nation-state, but won a Pyrrhic victory. The mob proved quite capable of taking care of politics by itself and liquidated the bourgeoisie, along with all other classes and institutions. That a movement of expansion for expansion's sake grew up in nation-states which more than any other political bodies were defined by boundaries and the limitations of possible conquest, is one example of the seemingly absurd disparities between cause and effect which have become the hallmark of modern history. The wild confusion of modern historical terminology is only a byproduct of these disparities. By comparisons with ancient empires, by mistaking expansion for conquest, by neglecting the difference between commonwealth and empire, which pre-imperialist historians called the difference between plantations and possessions, or colonies and dependencies, or, somewhat later, colonialism and imperialism. By neglecting, in other words, the difference between export of British people and export of British money, historians tried to dismiss the disturbing fact that so many of the important events in modern history look as though molehills had laboured and had brought forth mountains. Contemporary historians, confronted with the spectacle of a few capitalists conducting their predatory searches round the globe for new investment possibilities and appealing to the profit motives of the much too rich and the gambling instincts of the much too poor, want to clothe imperialism with the old grandeur of Rome and Alexander the Great, a grandeur which would make all following events more humanly tolerable. The disparity between cause and effect was betrayed in the famous, and unfortunately true, remark that the British Empire was acquired in a fit of absent-mindedness. It became cruelly obvious in our own time when a world war was needed to get rid of Hitler, which was shameful precisely because it was also comic. Something similar was already apparent during the Dreyfus affair, when the best elements in the nation were needed to conclude a struggle which had started as a grotesque conspiracy and ended as a farce. the only grandeur of imperialism lies in the nations losing battle against it. The tragedy of this half-hearted opposition was not that many national representatives could be bought by the new imperialist businessmen. Worse than corruption was the fact that the incorruptible were convinced that imperialism was the only way to conduct world politics. Since maritime stations and access to raw materials were really necessary for all nations, they came to believe that annexation and expansion worked for the salvation of the nation. They were the first to fail to understand the fundamental difference between the old foundation of trade and maritime stations for the sake of trade and the new policy of expansion. They believed Cecil Rhodes when he told them to wake up to the fact that you cannot live unless you have the trade of the world, that your trade is the world, and your life is the world, and not England, and that therefore they must deal with these questions of expansion and retention of the world. Without wanting to, sometimes even without knowing it, they not only became accomplices in imperialist politics, but were the first to be blamed and exposed for their imperialism. Such was the case of Clemenceau, who, because he was so desperately worried about the future of the French nation, turned imperialist in the hope that colonial manpower would protect French citizens against aggressors. In 1934, when Eichmann applied successfully for a job, the security service was a relatively new apparatus in the SS, founded 2 years earlier by Heinrich Himmler to serve as the intelligence service of the party, and now headed by Reinhard Heydrich, a former Navy intelligence officer who was to become, as Gerald Reidinger put it, the real engineer of the final solution. The Final Solution, 1961. Its initial task had been to spy on party members, and thus to give the SS an ascendancy over the regular party apparatus. Meanwhile, it had taken on some additional duties, becoming the Information and Research Centre for the Secret State Police, or Gestapo. These were the first steps toward the merger of the SS and the police, which, however, was not carried out until September 1939, although Himmler held the double post of Reichsführer, SS, and Chief of the German Police from 1936 on. Eichmann, of course, could not have known of these future developments, but he seems to have known nothing either of the nature of the SD when he entered it. This is quite possible, because the operations of the SD had always been top secret. As far as he was concerned, it was all a misunderstanding, and at first, a great disappointment. For I thought this was what I had read about in the Münchener Illustrierten Zeitung. When the high party officials drove along, there were commando guards with them, men standing on the running boards of the cars. In short, I had mistaken the security service of the Reichsführer SS for the Reich Security Service. And nobody set me right, and no one told me anything. For I had had not the slightest notion of what now was revealed to me. The question of whether he was telling the truth had a certain bearing on the trial, where it had to be decided whether he had volunteered for his position or had been drafted into it. His misunderstanding, if such it was, is not inexplicable. The SS originally been established as special units for the protection of the party leaders. His disappointment, however, consisted chiefly in that he had to start all over again, that he was back at the bottom, and his only consolation was that there were others who had made the same mistake. He was put into the information department, where his first job was to file all information concerning Freemasonry, which in the early Nazi ideological muddle was somehow lumped with Judaism, Catholicism, and communism, and to help in the establishment of a Freemasonry museum. He now had ample opportunity to learn what this strange word meant that Kaltenbrunner had thrown at him in their discussion of Schlaraffia. Incidentally, an eagerness to establish museums commemorating their enemies was very characteristic of the Nazis. During the war, several services competed bitterly for the honor of establishing anti-Jewish museums and libraries. We owe to this strange craze the salvage of many great cultural treasures of European Jewry. The trouble was that things were again very, very boring, and he was greatly relieved when, after 4 or 5 months of Freemasonry, he was put into the brand new department concerned with Jews. This was the real beginning of the career which was to end in the Jerusalem court. Since the whole problem of freedom arises for us in the horizon of Christian traditions on one hand, and of an originally anti-political philosophic tradition on the other, we find it difficult to realize that there may exist a freedom which is not an attribute of the will, but an accessory of doing and acting. Let us therefore go back once more to antiquity, i.e., to its political and pre-philosophical traditions, certainly not for the sake of erudition, and not even because of the continuity of our tradition, but merely because of freedom experienced in the process of acting, and nothing else though. Of course, mankind never lost this experience altogether, has never again been articulated with the same classical clarity. No doubt human life placed on the earth is surrounded by automatic processes, by the natural processes of the earth, which, in turn, are surrounded by cosmic processes, and we ourselves are driven by similar forces insofar as we too are a part of organic nature. Our political life, moreover, despite its being the realm of action, also takes place in the midst of processes which we call historical, and which tend to become as automatic as natural or cosmic processes, although they were started by men. The truth is that automatism is inherent in all processes, no matter what their origin may be, which is why no single act and no single event can ever, once and for all, deliver and save a man or a nation or mankind. It is in the nature of the automatic processes to which man is subject, but within and against which he can assert himself through action, that they can only spell ruin to human life. Once man-made, historical processes have become automatic. They are no less ruinous than the natural life process that drives our organism, and which, in its own terms, that is, biologically, leads from being to non-being, from birth to death. The historical sciences know only too well such cases of petrified and hopelessly declining civilizations where doom seems foreordained, like a biological necessity. And since such historical processes of stagnation can last and creep on for centuries, they even occupy by far the largest space in recorded history. The periods of being free have always been relatively short in the history of mankind. It is obvious that these reflections and descriptions are based on the conviction of the importance of making distinctions. To stress such a conviction seems to be a gratuitous truism in view of the fact that, at least as far as I know, nobody has yet openly stated that distinctions are nonsense. There exists, however, a silent agreement in most discussions among political and social scientists that we can ignore distinctions and proceed on the assumption that everything can eventually be called anything else, and that distinctions are meaningful only to the extent that each of us has the right to define his terms. Yet, does not this curious right, which we have come to grant as soon as we deal with matters of importance, as though it were actually the same as the right to one's own opinion, already indicate that such terms as tyranny, authority, totalitarianism have simply lost their common meaning, or that we have ceased to live in a common world where the words we have in common possess an unquestionable meaningfulness, so that, short of being condemned to live verbally in an altogether meaningless world, we grant each other the right to retreat into our own worlds of meaning and demand only that each of us remain consistent within his own private terminology. If, in these circumstances, we assure ourselves that we still understand each other, we do not mean that together we understand a world common to us all, but that we understand the consistency of arguing and reasoning, of the process of argumentation in its sheer formality. It is true that Roman political thought at a very early date began to use Platonic concepts in order to understand and interpret the specifically Roman political experiences. Yet, It seems as though it has been only in the Christian era that Plato's invisible spiritual yardsticks, by which the visible concrete affairs of men were to be measured and judged, have unfolded their full political effectiveness. Precisely those parts of Christian doctrine which would have had great difficulty in fitting in and being assimilated to the Roman political structure, namely, the revealed commandments and truths of a genuinely transcendent authority which, unlike Plato's, did not stretch above but was beyond the earthly realm, could be integrated into the Roman foundation legend via Plato. God's revelation could now be interpreted politically as if the standards for human conduct and the principle of political communities, intuitively anticipated by Plato, had been finally revealed directly, so that, in the words of a modern Platonist, it appeared as though Plato's early orientation toward the unseen measure was now confirmed through the revelation of the measure itself. To the extent that the Catholic Church incorporated Greek philosophy into the structure of its doctrines and dogmatic beliefs, it amalgamated the Roman political concept of authority, which inevitably was based on a beginning, a founding in the past, with the Greek notion of transcending measurements and rules. General and transcendent standards under which the particular and immanent could be subsumed were now required for any political order, moral rules for all interhuman behavior, and rational measurements for the guidance of all individual judgment. There is scared why anything that eventually was to assert itself with greater authority and more far-reaching consequences than the amalgamation itself. The failure of post-revolutionary thought to remember the revolutionary spirit and to understand it conceptually was preceded by the failure of the revolution to provide it with a lasting institution. The revolution, unless it ended in the disaster of terror, had come to an end with the establishment of a republic which, according to the men of the revolutions, was the only form of government which is not eternally at open or secret war with the rights of mankind. But in this republic, as it presently turned out, there was no space reserved, no room left for the exercise of precisely those qualities which had been instrumental in building it. And this was clearly no mere oversight, as though those who knew so well how to provide for power of the Commonwealth and the liberties of its citizens, for judgment and opinion, for interests and rights, had simply forgotten what actually they cherished above everything else, the potentialities of action and the proud privilege of being beginners of something altogether new. Certainly, they did not want to deny this privilege to their successors, but they also could not very well wish to deny their own work, although Jefferson, more concerned with this perplexity than anybody else, almost went to this extremity.